Tonight, a new political landscape, but challenges remain the same. China is seeking to expand its influence in the Pacific, while at home, Australians have expressed their frustration with the two-party system. How will the Albanese government respond? Welcome to Q&A. We're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight. And joining me on the panel, Independent Member for Kooyong, Monique Ryan, Liberal Senator for New South Wales, Andrew Bragg, Green Senator for New South Wales, Mehreen Faruqi, the Labor Member for Kingston, Amanda Rishworth, and former Liberal Foreign Affairs Minister Alexander Downer. Please make them all feel welcome. And a little later, we'll bring you a performance from singer-songwriter Kate Miller-Heidke. And remember, you can stream us on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Quanda is the hashtag. Please get involved. Our first question tonight comes from Caroline Streeter.
Could the panel please look into their crystal ball and tell me what they think might have happened at the election if Josh Frydenberg had replaced Scott Morrison as leader of the Liberal Party last September?
Well, Andrew Bragg, we might go to you first on that.
Well, thanks, Caroline. Thanks, David, for that opportunity. Look, I think it was a disappointing result for the Liberal Party on the weekend. And I think the main reason for that is because we didn't pursue enough ambitious economic policies and we went into divisive issues during the campaign. People would say to me in inner Sydney, why can't you deliver an integrity commission? Why aren't you doing net zero, even though we were doing net zero? And why are you talking about religious discrimination endlessly, and why are you pursuing these trans issues? And I think we went off course on those issues, and unfortunately that has cost us. So in order to rebuild, we need to refocus on economic policy, and we need to differentiate from the Labor Party and the Teals on that core platform of economic leadership.
Well, that may all be so. Caroline's asking, though, whether you might have done better with Josh Frydenberg.
Well, look, we'll never know. I mean, and the fact is that Josh has been a popular person and I think he represents a more live and let live approach that I think people are looking for, certainly in the inner city seats that we lost on the weekend. And I think it's very important that we return to a live and let live brand of liberalism. Libertarian brand. One that is more focused on fairness. And I think we have to make sure we protect minorities, that we are more caring, that we are more kind, that we take the issues around integrity and the issues that have been raised by women more seriously. And I think it's an opportunity for us now to reflect upon those issues as we go forward.
And we might explore some of that, but let's just cut to the chase. Did you approach Josh Frydenberg back in September of last year to challenge Scott Morrison?
Look, people are always assessing your electoral prospects. There was no formal push for there to be any type of coup.
But did you talk to him about it?
Well, you always talk about people's prospects. I mean, Josh has had a great...
Did you talk about that one?
Well, I mean, Josh. I mean, look, I've been a big fan of Josh's, and Josh has a lot to offer the country.
But did you approach him and talk about challenge?
We always talk about electoral prospects, but everyone knows that Josh had leadership ambitions. I still think he has a lot to offer the country, and let's see what happens in the future.
Yeah, sorry to press on this, but I'm just trying to get an answer to Caroline's question, which goes to whether you would have been better with Josh Frydenberg. Did you go to him saying you need to challenge Scott Morrison?
Look, it's very possible that we would have been better off with Josh Frydenberg, but we'll never know. It's a hypothetical.
But it's not a hypothetical whether you approached him.
There was no formal push for a coup, and Josh was always very loyal to the former PM.
OK. Alexander Downer, I'm keen for your thoughts on this. You're a former Liberal leader, but you also had a former staffer once called Josh Frydenberg. He worked for you. I know you rate him. Do you think, in hindsight, they would have been better with him as leader?
Well, you never know what would have happened had he become the leader. So these counter-narratives are always hard to prove. I mean, anything could have happened. But it's a great question because he is a man who would have made a great leader, and he will. He will come back again. And he is a huge loss to our country. You know, no reflection on the woman who defeated him. It's not a reflection on her, Monique. But he is somebody with great integrity, a great intellect, a lot of personal charm, and an incredibly hard worker. So, I mean, I think he is a tragic loss to the Parliament, regardless of party politics. So he didn't become the leader. The Liberals had changed their leader 3 times since the 2013 election when Tony Abbott was elected. No doubt they were a bit reluctant yet again to change the leader. But in the future, my prediction is that Josh Frydenberg will get back into Parliament and one day he'll be the Prime Minister of this country. The next Liberal Prime Minister? I don't know about the next, but he will achieve that eventually. Monique, Ryan, I am keen for your views on this. Look, it is a complete hypothetical that Caroline's asking, but it's a fascinating one. Would it have made life harder, would it have made your task harder of winning Kooyong if Josh Frydenberg had been the leader and Scott Morrison was not?
Oh, look, perhaps, David, but I would probably also argue that one of the challenges I faced in Kooyong was the fact that people said, yes, but if Josh goes, we'll get Dutton, which was an interesting question for people to raise and something that did play out.
So, sorry, people were reluctant to vote for you, some of them, because they were worried that Peter Dutton would become leader.
Yes, and in fact I understand that there was some discussion in the Frydenberg camp last week of printing flyers that said, vote for Ryan, get Dutton. Such was the desperation in the Liberal camp in Kooyong about the fact that Mr Frydenberg was clearly struggling electorally.
All right, well,
I would ask a question, though, of Caroline, and of Mr Downer and of Andrew, what would have happened if the Liberal Party had gone with Julie Bishop rather than Scott Morrison 3 years ago?
Well, we're getting into some hypotheticals here. I suspect we'll get a similar hypothetical non-answer over here. But, Caroline, I'm going to ask you, would it have made a difference to your vote?
Probably not, but I'm very, very keen to see much greater diversity in our government.
All right.
Caroline, could I respond to you by saying that I've been in the Senate now for the past 3.5 years, and it was a pretty toxic, rotten government. So the verdict that was delivered in thoroughly rejecting Scott Morrison, the former Prime Minister, and geez, that feels really good to say that, the former Prime Minister, it wasn't just the verdict on the former Prime Minister, it was actually a verdict on the Liberal national government. And Josh Frydenberg had been in a key leadership position in that particular government. So I don't think we would have had a much different outcome. But what I am seriously concerned about now is that Peter Dutton will become the opposition leader. This is a man who boycotted the apology to the stolen generations. This is a man who engaged in really outrageous fear-mongering on the so-called African gang violence in Melbourne. This is a man who, after the Christchurch mosque attacks, where 51 innocent Muslims were murdered by an Australian man, claimed that I was the same as Fraser Anning, who was a far-right senator, thankfully gone now as well, and who basically blamed Muslim immigration for that attack. So I am very concerned that we will get into the same divisive politics that have been under Tony Abbott, under Scott Morrison. And I think the Liberal Party should think really hard in choosing the next leader.
We will come back to... We do have further questions on where to now for the Liberal Party, but Amanda Rishworth, let's get some opening thoughts from you on this.
Out on the hustings, there's no doubt that Scott Morrison, there was a lot of negative feeling about him, but he was the figurehead, as Mehreen said, of a government that had made a lot of mistakes, and he was the treasurer that had made a lot of pockets of money for car parks and the car park routes and so many other things. didn't buy enough rat tests, didn't budget enough. So there are a lot of mistakes the government made in which, yes, Scott Morrison was the leader, but I think the concern and the frustration out there in the community went much further than Scott Morrison. He became a symbol of frustration with the lack of action on climate change, the lack of an ICAC, the lack of action on and appreciation of cost of living pressures. I think he became a symbol of what was becoming a very unpopular government.
Let's move on to our next question, which comes from Lee Shi-Su.
Good evening. The success of the Labour Party in the federal elections appears undermined by its low primary vote. Only the wheeling and dealing inherent in our preferential voting system hold it over the line. So, how credible and legitimate is the new Labour government's mandate when 7 out of 10 voters did not pick the Labour Party as their first choice?
Amanda Rishworth.
Well, look, we have preferential voting in this country, which ensures that people can have a say, but they can also say who they don't want to be in government. That's what preferential voting does. Now, I reject some of the parts in the question when we're looking at a situation where the Labor Party is approaching majority government. And a few weeks ago, people were saying that was never going to happen, that we weren't going to get a majority government. It was going to be a hung parliament. But I think the Australian people clearly in the results voted this government out. They voted for change, and many of the things that the Labor Party was pushing, that some of the independents were pushing, and indeed the Greens were pushing, are the same things. Action on climate change, a new ICAC, a proper integrity in our government. There were a lot of things that people rejected from the Liberal Party and embraced with change. And I think there's a lot. Now, there are places that we do need to have a look at where our primary vote was not as good. There's places where we need to take that very seriously.
So what are those places? I want to come back to the question here.
Well, there's obviously results in Brisbane, there's results in Tasmania where we didn't get as high a vote as we could. But I also point to the fact that some Labor voters in seats where they didn't think they were going to actually win and were concerned about that, actually probably voted very pragmatically. And you can see that in so-called teal seats. If you look at the seats next door, there's a much higher primary vote for Labor. And indeed, if you look at the Senate in those seats, there's higher primary votes. So there are a lot of people out there that just the first instinct was to get rid of the government and therefore were pragmatic. So there's a range of things that we do, of course, have to listen in those areas that didn't put Labor first. And I think Anthony Albanese has been very clear. He wants to bring people together and actually look at a way forward.
Mehreen, Faruqi, do you agree with what Amanda Rishworth is saying there, or do you share the view that Labor doesn't actually have a strong mandate given its primary vote?
There are so many good things that happened on Saturday. And I, for one, my face actually hurts because I've been smiling for the last 5 days. You know, of course, the Greens got our best result ever in a federal campaign. We had a positive swing in every single state and territory. And, you know, Queensland is now Greensland. And shout out to my friends in Queensland. But I think, you know, apart from the rejection of the Morrison government, there also has been a rejection of the two-party system. I think our voters in Australia have said bye-bye two parties. It's the largest number ever in the history of crossbenchers in the lower house. The Greens will have 12 senators in the upper house, so we will have the balance of power.
So what does that mean for Labor's mandate?
Well, this is what it means. I think Labor is on notice, and the people have told Labor that they have to work and listen to the others that have been voted in such large numbers. So they don't have a sole mandate.
And Monique Ryan,
and particularly on climate and inequality, I think they have spoken very loudly and clearly. And I think Labor should pay heed to that.
And Monique Ryan, I'm assuming you agree with that about what Labor's mandate is from this election?
Yeah, look, I think Labor does have a mandate in that it has a majority in the House of Representatives, but it is going to have to work with the crossbench in the House and with the minorities in the Senate as well.
If it has a majority, though, in the House, will it have to work with the crossbench?
I think it will. It will to forward its platform in all areas. I actually think that the election was a victory for preferential voting and for the system. I think you're right, the two-party system is dead, but what people did, in my electorate at least, was to vote strategically. So people who'd been lifelong Labor voters voted for me because they wanted a change in their representative, same with the Greens, and actually same with a large number of lifelong Liberal voters as well. But people their vote reflected their understanding of the system and they affected the change that they wanted to see.
Alexander Downer, is the two-party system dead, as some have suggested?
Oh, well, to say dead is to show that you have huge prescience about the future. I mean, of course, it's an absurd proposition. We don't know.
We have seen this drop, though, in the primary vote.
The two-party system was reduced, if you like, at this election, and just what did they get between the two of them? 68%.
Yeah, just under 70%. It used to be 90%, right, back in your time?
Not in my time, but earlier.
A bit earlier,
yes, and just to make this point, the trend internationally is towards, if you like, a fragmentation of politics and away from more traditional two-party systems. But I think it's hard to know. First of all, in answer to the question, of course, if we had first past the post system, a system in Australia, well, the Liberal Party this National Party's got 36%. 36. And Labor got 32% or 30, whatever, 32%.
Well, yeah.
However, but that... And so, according to that theory, the Liberals would have won the election. But, of course, if we had first past the post voting, people would have voted in different ways. So the Greens would have got a much smaller vote, and Labor would have got a much bigger vote. So, you know, in answer to the question, I'm not sure that changing it would necessarily change the outcome, but it is important to look at the international trends, which is towards the atomisation of politics, and of course it leads to more unstable government as a result.
But is there a need for the major parties to have a better look at themselves at why this is happening? Because it isn't just
I think it's demographic, actually. I think it's a function of changes in the education system. People used to vote on class grounds. Working class people, as they were called, used to vote Labor. Masses of them don't now. A lot of them vote Liberal. The rich, like the people in Kooyong, you know, they used to vote Liberal automatically. Well, you can see from the result of the election, you saw that in Wentworth and in Warringah and Curtin over in Western Australia. The rich, their votes are spreading all over the place now. So, you know, I mean, people don't vote on class grounds and simple grounds in the way they used to before. They spray around much more, and that's true in the UK, in the US, everywhere.
I want to turn to the challenges, some of the challenges confronting the new government. Our next question comes from Dylan Mail.
Thanks, Beezy, and hello, panellists. The question I like to ask is, what are the strengths that Australia should leverage more to ensure we are the partner of choice for Pacific nations such as Solomon Islands? Where are we going wrong, and what can we do right?
Monique, Ryan, I might start with you on that.
Well, I think what we can do is we can have a presence in the Pacific that we haven't had in the last 5 to 10 years, a positive presence rather than the absence of a presence or the lack of a true and respectful relationship that countries like Solomon Islands want from us. Now, the countries in the Pacific have told us repeatedly that their single greatest concern is the effects of climate change. And we have refused to engage in that space in a way that demonstrates to them our respect for that concern. And so that's the very first thing that we can do, and we should do, and that is to everyone's benefit. We can also then provide additional aid along the lines of the sort of maritime and defence assistance that those sorts of countries are grateful for. We can provide them help with things like their COVID response, which has been a significant problem. We can reinstitute aspects of the Australian network. We can be a respectful partner in the region rather than someone who's a big brother who's largely absent and often condescending.
Andrew Bragg?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, there are limits on what you can do when you're competing against countries that will do things that Australia can't do. And the fact is that a lot of these democracies are weak institutionally, and they are prone to being subject to coercion by larger nations.
And are you suggesting bribes are being...
Well, I mean, the fact is that we can't do things that some other countries can do because we don't do those sort of things. And so it's very difficult to compete. And I would say that we've had a significant step up in the past few years in our region, but you can't control everything. And I don't accept the argument that we haven't been a good citizen in relation to climate change. I mean, we're part of the Accords. We've signed on to net zero. I'm sure there's more we can do. I'm sure there's more, but we have. We're part of that agreement. I mean, I'm not sure whether these talking points worked for you during the campaign, but I mean,
clearly they did.
I mean, the fact is, but I mean, in the real world and in diplomacy, I mean, facts matter, and we've signed on to the Glasgow Accord. We're on track to get to net zero, and so these are the commitments that the government of Australia has already made. So you might want to catch up on that.
Alexander Downer, let me bring you in here. Did the Morrison government drop the ball at all on the Pacific?
Well, they had the step up in the Pacific, and over the years, I think it's fair to say Australian governments have been very focused on the Pacific. I mean, I'm not sure where this idea that they had nothing to do with the Pacific came from. We have embassies and high commissions all around the Pacific. Ministers travelled around the Pacific. I mean, it's just a party political point to criticise the government in that way. I think there's a deeper issue, though, and Andrew touches on it. Look, let's be brutally frank about this. In the case of the Solomon Islands, China presented, how can I put it, without getting the ABC into any trouble, inducements to the Solomon Islands government to do what it did. And it's very difficult for the Australian government to counter that.
Is there evidence of that?
I would have been much more public myself about it. I mean, I had my own arguments with Prime Minister Sogavare, and I just took him on. And maybe the Australian government should have taken on, in the future, should take him on more directly.
So what should Marise Payne or Scott Morrison have done?
Well, what should they do now? I mean, I think that we should call for the Solomon for greater, how can I put it, greater transparency about what has happened in the Solomon Islands and about the relationship between China and the Solomon Islands leadership. I think we, the Australian public, would like to know much more about that relationship. And so, by the way, would the public of the Solomon Islands, because the thing about the public in the Solomon Islands is they, and I know this from such long experience, they really treasure the relationship with Australia and the support that Australia gives to the Solomon Islands. And I think they feel very uncomfortable about what Sogavare and his colleagues have done with the People's Republic of China. And I think Australia should be, you know, upfront and open about what we think has been happening there.
You need evidence, though, to do that as a government, don't you? For an Australian Foreign Minister to stand up and say something's gone wrong.
There are all sorts of ways. Having been the Foreign Minister for nearly 12 years, I can tell you there are all sorts of ways the Australian government accumulates evidence.
How so?
Well, we have all sorts of agencies which collect evidence.
With bugs?
Yes.
Well, and so possibly your proposition here is we should close down our intelligence services. I think that would be a huge mistake myself.
Is that what you're suggesting, though, that we should use intelligence agencies to gather this information and put it out there publicly?
Well, we've used intelligence agencies for decades to do this sort of thing.
Is that right?
Well, everybody knows that. And it's, we have a parliamentary committee that actually I set up when I was the Foreign Minister that oversees the work of our intelligence agencies. Members of Parliament are familiar with the work.
So spying on foreign governments,
spying
on foreign governments, and then making anything that is helpful to our foreign policy public as a result.
That happens from time to time, of course.
The view,
well, just one moment on that, Senator, because it does bring us to our next question, a video question, which comes from Greg Rubbock in Hobart in Tasmania.
My question is to Alexander Downer. Mr Downer, given that the Chinese foreign minister's sweep through Pacific nations will include Timor-Leste, do you reflect on the allegations that your government bugged the cabinet rooms of the Timor-Leste government?
So did Australia bug the East Timor cabinet rooms?
Well, so as has been the case with all Australian governments since the Second World War, we certainly don't get into any discussion about intelligence operations, specific intelligence operations, and never will. I mean, I'm not a minister anymore.
You were
but
at
I
the time,
certainly never. I was, but I would certainly never betray the confidences that I have and the obligations that I have to support the privacy of the work that our intelligence agencies do. But we have,
you've said in general sense we do this.
We have ways, of course, of the intelligence services are overseen in any case. So they operate, of course, under the law, under Australian law.
Yeah, they do. But you've just said, in a general sense, this is what we do, but in a specific case of East Timor, you won't confirm.
Correct.
Okay. Should the Cabinet papers from that time be made public?
No, I think we need to protect our intelligence services or not have them at all. I mean, our practices here, by the way, are no different from any of our other allied countries. The UK, New Zealand, the United States, all of our countries have intelligence services. What our intelligence services do is collect intelligence. That's what they exist for.
Of course,
I mean, the suggestion that somehow we have intelligence services but they don't collect intelligence is absurd. Of course they collect intelligence. And
the criticism of this example on East Timor, however, is that this went beyond diplomacy and general intelligence gathering. This was timed for the negotiations over the oil and gas treaty with East Timor, a fledgling nation at the time.
Well, so it's alleged. But as I said, we certainly, at no time in my life will I ever get into betraying the obligations that I undertook when I was the Foreign Minister to support the integrity of our intelligence services. If we start talking about intelligence operations publicly, we will destroy the capacity of our intelligence services to do the jobs they do for the Australian people. I mean, we would simply destroy our intelligence services. And I think it's really important people come to understand that. Well, there's an argument for not having any intelligence services, and I think the Greens would probably take that view. I mean, you know, it's a legitimate point of view.
Well, we'll see if
But if you're going to have intelligence services, you have to protect the privacy and the integrity of those institutions.
Senator?
Mr. Downer is a relic of a time and a government that thought going to war on Iraq was a good thing. What disastrous consequences did that lead us to? Mr. Downer was pivotal in the Pacific solution, where he negotiated with Nauru and PNG, the cruelest system, the most inhumane system for asylum seekers. I don't think anyone should be taking advice on foreign affairs from Mr. Downer.
Okay, we're talking about the use of intelligence here.
But I do want to respond.
You're into the ad hominem attacks, aren't you?
I didn't get an opportunity to answer the
Let's just let the Senator answer.
I do want to talk about how both Andrew and Alexander have spoken about the Pacific nations in a colonial, superior, big brother, and that's what intelligence gathering in that sense is about, attitude. These are sovereign nations who have every right to make decisions about their foreign policies with whoever they want to. You know, why they aren't talking to us is because for years there has been one priority asked for them, and that has been to act strongly on climate change. They have been asking for us to end coal and gas, and we have not done that. Unless we do that, we will not have good relations with those countries whose, you know, where water is lapping on their doorsteps.
Amanda Rishworth.
It's an existential crisis, and we're not acting on it. So we have to stop Beetaloo project. We have to stop the Scarborough project. We have to stop the 114 coal and gas mines and projects that both the Liberal and the Labor governments are pushing.
Amanda Rishworth, coming back to the Pacific.
Yes.
Labor's now in government.
Yes.
Do you share at all the view of Alexander Downer that we should be using intelligence to gather information on what China may be doing in these Pacific nations and use that?
Well, I do. I'm not going to comment on what our intelligence agencies are doing. I am not privy to that. I've been in opposition. What I would say is if you've got a good trust with friends in your region, then what you can have is information sharing. And I reject Alexander Downer's comment that these are political talking points. We had a government that cut foreign aid.
I didn't say they were political talking points.
You said that we were doing partisan points on when it came to the Pacific. You did say that, and I'm saying that aid was cut, that things like the Parliamentary Exchange Program was cut. And of course, we weren't listening when it came to climate change, but other needs of the Pacific. We weren't listening to our Pacific neighbours. There's other things that strategically we're in the Pacific. We are with our Pacific neighbours, and that gives us a strategic advantage on things like labour mobility programs, which we stuffed up as a government. It is now up to Labor, and I am so pleased Penny Wong has gone straight on a plane to Fiji to actually see what she can do. And the Prime Minister of Fiji has been very welcoming of that. But this is the type of energy and resources we need directed to the Pacific, treating them like partners, treating them like friends.
OK, I want to get to our next question, which comes from Nathan Davamoni.
Thank you. Hi all. Do you think that China hawking from the more conservative politicians in Australia will interfere in current governments repairing our relationship with China going forward?
Well, Amanda Rishworth, maybe to you first on that one. What do you think?
Well, look, I think Australia's position hasn't changed on China in terms of the change of government. Penny Wong has been very consistent that the relationship with China has become much more complex over time as a result of China's change in attitude. So it is a difficult and complex relationship to negotiate. We're going to have to do that in a clear and a focused way, but one that absolutely puts our national interest at the forefront. And really, you know, really China could start by removing their tariffs and sanctions on Australia. They are unjustified and unwarranted, and that would be a start in the relationship repair, but the ball is in their court. And Australia's position has not changed in terms of asserting our national interests.
Nathan's reference to China hawking is, I guess, a reference to language sometimes being over the top in criticising what China's doing. Andrew Bragg, do you think some of your colleagues went too far in their language?
I think the former government took a strong position on values on China, and China didn't like that, but Australia was steadfast, and I think they will be watching to see if Labor is going to change the position. I would say, though, taking the long view, it's not in our interests to have a bad relationship with China. I mean, we actually want to lift the tenor of the debate here as much as we can.
So tone down the language.
Yeah, without compromising our values. But it's actually a very important relationship for us, and we want it to be in a better position. That's really important to our country.
So the sort of things that Peter Dutton, for example, said, we've got to prepare for war, was that helpful?
Look, I think in the past, some of the rhetoric has been a bit overblown. I think there's no doubt about that.
That language?
Look, I'm not making any reflection on any particular colleague here. You wouldn't expect me to.
Well, I'm inviting you to.
Well, I say you're...
I'm happy to make that reflection if you want me to.
I mean, thank goodness you're not running the government. But your invitation...
Well, you're not running it either anymore.
Well,
thank God for that.
Well, it might surprise you that I never was.
That's true.
But I thank you for your kind invitations, and I invite you to make more invitations in the future.
OK, well, we might do that. It brings us, in fact, to our next question, which comes from Erin Upson. Erin.
Hi, everyone. If the Liberal Party does indeed appoint Peter Dutton as leader, arguably a step even further to the right, how are the Liberals ever going to recover? And do you see a decision like that as the beginning of the end for the party?
Now, Erin, before we get some answers, I do need to disclose that you, as I understand it, volunteered in handing out how to vote cards for Monique Ryan. I don't think you've met Monique Ryan before, but you did volunteer as a Teal volunteer. So just putting that on the record. Andrew Bragg, let me come back to you. Is a Peter Dutton leadership, to use Erin's words, the beginning of the end of the Liberal Party?
I mean, not at all. And I think the Liberal Party will do best when it's a broad church. And as Peter has said today, it's not the Moderates Party, it's not the Conservative Party, it's a Liberal Party. It's been a very successful vehicle for Australia for the past 75 years. There have been periods in the past where there have been, discussions about the future of the party, and we're having one of those periods now. But the broad church will be maintained, I'm sure. And look, people talk about Nixon going to China. I mean, I'm sure that there are things...
The question was about Peter Dutton.
Yeah, well, answering the question.
Is he the one you want as leader?
Well, I'm talking about Nixon and China here, which is a reference to which is a reference to the perception that has been made in the question that I think sometimes a leader that is coming from a particular part of a party can do more than perhaps someone who's come from the hard centre, if you know what I mean. So I remain open-minded about where we might be able to land on things like Indigenous recognition, on emissions reduction, on integrity commissions and the like. And my hope is that we can work with a new parliament to get the best possible legislation through.
And is he the best option for you as leader?
Well, I think he's a very impressive man. I think he has shown himself to be a person that has a lot of integrity and a person that at least you know where you stand. I mean,
but do you want him as leader?
Look, I mean, at the end of the day, some people in my party are social liberals, some people are social conservatives. I'm not so big on these labels, but at least you know where you stand with Peter. He has been...
Sorry, just to come back to the question, this is a pretty simple one. Do you want Peter Dutton as your leader?
Well, it's not my decision to make solely, and it's not for me to say right here, right now.
No one else in this room gets a vote. Do you want Peter Dutton as leader?
I think he would make a good leader for the Liberal Party, yes, I do. And I think, you know, Mr Albanese totally reinvented himself in the last parliament, and he's just been elected as Prime Minister of Australia. So, I mean, people do evolve over the time. I think Peter has made the point himself that he has had some pretty tough portfolios where he's had to be the bad guy from time to time. And so let's see how it goes.
Monique, Ryan?
Look, I think the Liberal Party really needs to take a really good hard look at itself. It's moved to the right far too much, and that's why people such as myself, who are sensible centrists, have stepped into the middle, representing the values of traditional small L Liberals. The National Party hasn't done that in the last 3 years, 6 years, and the Liberal Party has failed to do that. And that's why so-called people who have tried to paint themselves as moderate Liberals, like Josh Frydenberg, have lost their seats in the federal election because they're not representing the values of the communities from which they've been elected.
The question about Peter Dutton, though,
Peter Dutton is a right-winger, and he's a hawk. He has been belligerent towards China in a way that has not only alienated the People's Republic of China, it has had a significant impact on the many Chinese Australians who have felt victimised within this country and have suffered as a result of his actions. And him being elected as leader of the Liberal Party will cement that problem within that party.
Alexander Downer, you've been a Liberal leader in opposition. It's a tough gig. Do you think Peter Dutton is the right choice?
I think he will be the choice, and I think he is the right choice. I think he's a very good and a very tough politician, and it's a very tough job. My answer to a lot of the comments that have been made about left wing and right wing and so on, I mean, you know, I've left politics a long time ago. These labels don't really mean anything. What will mean something is that we won't be fighting the 2022 election ever again. And so the circumstances of the future will be very different. And I think what will be very different is the state of the economy. And it really surprised me through the election campaign how candidates left, right and centre were not put under pressure on these issues. What are you going to do to address the issue of the rising cost of living? And I think inflation is going to rise. I think as a result, interest rates are going to rise. And the reason we've got into this situation, it's partly international, partly national. In response to COVID, there has been a massive increase in spending and printing of money right around the world. So you've got a flood of money. It's very inflationary. And do we have a strategy to counter it? So what you're going to see...
Too much spending here?
Appropriate amounts of spending to compensate for the lockdowns that there were and the closures of businesses.
But
if we hadn't done that, people would, of course, gone bankrupt and starved. So it had to be done if we were to have those sort of lockdowns and closures. But my point is we are, and around the world, but here in Australia, we are paying the price for that, and that's part of the price of that is going to be inflation, higher interest rates and lower and declining real wages.
On
and
the future
next election, by the time we get to the next election, these economic issues are going to be front and centre, in my view, of the national debate.
Let me ask you this, though. Should the Liberals at that next election be trying to chase back seats like Kooyong?
Yeah.
Or not?
Yeah, of course, yeah. Well, the Liberal Party, I mean, look,
you know there's this debate at the moment, right? There's this debate about what direction the party should go.
Every great political party has terrible setbacks. This has certainly been a setback. But I went through the 1983 election defeat, the unwinnable election, the unlosable election that we lost in 1993, we lost in 2007. We've had some terrible moments and we've had some great victories. And my view is, look, every election is different. And the one thing the one piece of advice I would give the Liberal Party is, look, get back on your horse and be prepared to fight the next election. And in the meantime, hold all these people, you know, they're all triumphalists at the moment, but hold them to account. Hold them to account and make sure they answer the hard questions, including the questions I've been raising about the future of the economy. When real wages start to decline, what are their answers going to be?
Well, they have been declining for a little while already.
Right.
Our next question comes...
Can I ask, David, why do we have to be held to account for the mess that the Morrison government has left us with?
Yeah. You will have to be held to account from this, you know, from Saturday onwards for all that happens on your watch. They were held to account and they lost the election. They've paid the price for that. They made mistakes, of course, and they were held to account, and now you will be held to account. And you should be held to account, because it would be a bad democracy if you thought you could come into office and hold the Liberals who are now out of office to account for the past and you not be held to account. So you need to, in the future, to answer for what happens in this country, and as of course does the Labor Party.
Well, I think there is an issue that you're missing when it comes to what the Liberal Party needs to do, and that is to actually listen to what the people have said in this election. And when we look at the leadership of Peter Dutton, it looks like Scott Morrison 2.0. I mean, when you actually look on National Sorry Day, we're talking about how we go forward with the Uluru Statement of the Heart. What we have is a potential leader of the Liberal Party that walked out of the national apology. That was nothing to do with his portfolio. That was a personal choice that he made. So
he has expressed regret over that.
Well, I think it is important that the Liberal Party, it does listen, and when we're in the Parliament, of course part of their job is to hold the alternative government or the government to account. But it's also to actually listen to the results on the weekend and actually work constructively instead of completely playing politics. And I think that's partly what was rejected on Saturday, not to just play politics for politics' sake. That'll be something that Peter Dutton will have
to do. Well, that in fact brings us...
You're already attacking Peter Dutton.
Thank God for the Liberal Party.
This is the nicest style of politics.
No.
That you attack Peter Dutton before he's even elected the leader of the opposition. Both of you do.
There is enough evidence.
He's a terrible person.
Hang on.
Tanya Plibersek had to apologise for using him.
Hang on.
Just very quickly.
This is the nice of politics.
Hang on. I was just giving him some free advice, and I would urge him to listen to it.
This debate... The tone of this debate and the way it's going brings us, in fact, to a really good question, our next one, which comes from Mike Game.
Thanks, David. I'm a believer that Australia and Australians are best served and have been best served by our two-party system. And I'm relieved that it looks like one of those parties will now form the government. However, my sense is that the apparently simple solutions to complex problems offered by the independents means that we may not see a strong party with a majority going forward leading the government. Beyond this term, are we destined to a future in which the governing major party will be held to ransom by the narrow pork barrelling of the independents?
Monique, Ryan, maybe to you first on that.
I find that a really extraordinary question, actually. I mean, I would point out that last month, Alexander, in the Fin Review, called the independents loathsome pork barrel gangsters. Now,
It's quite funny.
is that my youth?
Correct.
I have spent the last 6 months talking to my electorate about the things that matter to them. I had 2,000 volunteers and we knocked on every knockable door in that electorate and had 55,000 conversations about what mattered to the electorate. I asked them what they would like me to do were I their representative in Parliament. At no point did I promise anything to anyone. I was elected on a platform that included, the primary thing was effective and immediate action on climate change, which neither of the major parties have promised to this point. Is that pork barrelling, or is that giving the people of my electorate what they want and what the country needs if I achieve that for them?
But how are you going to achieve that? So, hang on.
Mike, look, just one sec, Mike. Just let me get a quick response from you. What's the pork barrelling you're talking
nothing
about?
I agree exactly that Monique should admirably, and it sounds like she is representing the interests of her electorate. But the independent candidates may represent, say, 5 out of 151 electorates. And my point is that they're not representing the majority of electorates within the country.
Well, it's more than 5, but look, no, it's not a majority of the electorates in the country.
Actually, that would have a balance of power, though. You could have a situation where
you could have a situation with a balance of power, but you did suggest pork barrelling by independents. There's no evidence of that if they don't actually control the purse strings. Alexander Downer, your description, what was it? Loathsome...
Loathsome pork barrel gangsters.
Yes, well,
How do you defend that?
Some of the independent candidates around the... I don't know in the case of Kooyong at all, but I do know in other parts of the country they go around, you know, promising grants left, right and centre, which I'm...
Kooyong, Mr Feinberg, let's not forget the car park roads and the sports roads. That's the pork barrelling that the Liberal Party has been doing in marginal states to buy votes.
They all do it. They all do it. It is true.
But it is a point that we have. We've seen,
right.
Alexander Downer, as you well know, we've seen candidates, Liberal candidates who aren't even in Parliament, present big blank cheques as part of their campaign.
Yeah, no, I'm saying all political parties have been engaged in pork barrelling. One of the things that the Labor Party did during the election campaign was announce that they were cutting back on, if elected, which they have been, they'll cut back on community grant schemes. I actually think that's a very good idea to cut back on those schemes. Yeah, and I personally don't approve, and that's the whole point. I don't approve of pork barrelling. But I mean, to get back to the question that was actually asked, I hope the Labor Party gets... I don't know if it has today, but I hope it gets its 76 seats.
75 at the moment, so...
So I hope they get their 76th seat, because I want the Labor Party, having won the election, and through the preferential system entirely legitimately, they have won the election, I think they should be allowed to govern.
Well,
and I
Mehreen,
think if they can't govern,
because
you're going to find very weak an incoherent government, and this is a country that it needs.
Let me get a response
That's the rhetoric that you want to put out there. The people of Australia have voted, and they have voted for a parliament which has a diversity of people in many ways. Diversity of parties, more women, more ethnically diverse candidates, more First Nations candidates. They want these people to actually debate issues. And you talked about complex issues. We need to debate complex issues. These decisions shouldn't be made. And that's what the community has said behind closed doors with the two major parties, one of the major parties sitting with the lobbyists, have the numbers and just push that through. Now what we will have is open debate on these issues with the public. Will be able to participate and see. That's what the community wants. That's what the community has voted for. And we should respect that. I think it is a much more democratic outcome than having one or the other major party just say they have a mandate.
All right, I want to keep moving because there's a couple more questions we want to get to. Our next one comes from Fiona Bricknell.
Hi. With Labor's plan for cheaper childcare, how will the government support the potential of more families wanting to enrol children in a sector where we already have a massive staff shortage?
Amanda Rishworth.
Yeah, look, thank you. Previous to the election, I was the Shadow Minister for Early Education. I don't necessarily haven't been appointed to that role, but we've put out a very ambitious policy when it comes to making childcare more affordable, and we know we need to have the workforce to deliver that. The shortage of early educators, but also aged care workers right across the care economy, we are facing a huge shortage.
So what are you going to do about it? Because we know your policy was higher subsidies for families, but Fiona, you're a childcare worker, right? You talk about staff shortages. Just give Amanda Rishworth a bit of an idea of what that looks like where you've worked.
Well, I think the main thing is not being able to hire permanent staff, and it's come to a point where I know that you can't even get agencies to come in and replace that, and we work on ratio, so we need to have a certain amount of educators to children. I'm aware from people I work with have had to turn families away from the centres because they don't have enough staff to be able to support the children in for that day. And
is that mainly the pay isn't high enough to attract enough staff into the industry?
I think so, and I think we're also overworked, especially after COVID, and we've also lost a lot of workers during COVID because of visa issues. And so, there's a lot of layers, I think, when it comes to childcare.
So what are you going to do about that?
So the government has had sitting on its table since October a workforce strategy. That has just been sitting there gathering dust. I would assume that whoever would come into the role would look at that very carefully, but it is a problem across the care industry. We can't ignore that. Labor has also talked about free TAFE places in areas of critical workforce shortage, and we've also outlined a plan to ensure that the Fair Work Commission can properly look at the level of pay for those in the care and community sector. So this isn't going to be off to be turned around overnight.
Well, just 3 years ago, you did have a policy at that election in 2019 to increase the pay directly of childcare workers. You dropped that at this election.
We recognise that this is a systematic issue across the care industry. There's a shortage of aged care workers. There's a shortage of early educators. There's a shortage of nurses. Across the caring economy, we have a problem here that the previous government completely ignored. We have to address it. We have to address it through our industrial relations system, but we have to actually...
Sorry, what's the solution? It's to leave it to the Fair Work Commission.
Well, we are going to put pay equity as a principle in the Fair Work Commission. We've also discussed having we've said we'll have an expert panel when it comes to the care and community work to work out how we chart that course. But there's a workforce strategy there that the sector has had a say in, and the government has sat on it. So we need to work out how we implement that along with the sector.
OK, just quickly, Andrew Bragg.
Well, I think childcare is one of the most important policy areas that we now face, and I see it as an economic opportunity for the country. I think we have to have a good look at how we're doing it. We are putting a lot of money into the childcare centres through the subsidy. Under our government, and Labor have a broader plan to do that, which I think is worth looking at. But we may need to look at whether we can incentivise in-home care as part of a way to alleviate some of the staffing issues. Because
subsidies for
nannies and the like. I think all these things are worth.
So extend childcare subsidies to nannies.
I mean, the whole idea of plugging billions and billions of dollars into these childcare centres, it might not be the best outcome for the country. So I think one thing I'd like to do, if given the opportunity in this parliament, is to look into how we could do it differently or better, because we are ploughing a lot of money into these centres, and it might not be the best way. I mean, I think that maybe when this first started 20 or 30 years ago, it was seen as a bit of a hobby, but it is a really important economic plan for the country to get people back to work, and we have to get it right. I mean, I think it's a really... What's wrong?
Do you want to offer a view on that idea?
Well, I guess I just sort of thought of childcare, it's something I'm very passionate about. So when you said it was a hobby, I just thought it was kind of funny. That's all.
No, I didn't mean it in that way. I guess what I was saying was, I think some people, when I was a kid, saw it as something that you did a little bit, as it wasn't really a core industry. Now it's a huge industry, and it's critical for the country. We want everyone and every family to have every opportunity to get back to work as soon as possible. And the way that we fund it and invest in it is really critical. So I think it's something that my party needs to look at in this parliament, and I'm personally very committed to it.
All right, we need to move to our final question tonight, which comes from Jacob Myers.
Today's National Sorry Day, and it's 14 years since Kevin Rudd's incoming Labor government made the apology. Anthony Albanese has been very clear that he wants the Uluru Statement from the Heart to be a priority of this incoming government. But how much support will a referendum for constitutional recognition receive from the incoming independents?
Now, I should point out too that next week's program, Stan Grant is going to be taking a much closer look at this issue, where to now on a voice to Parliament and enshrining that in the Constitution. But to you first on this, Monique Ryan, the question's about incoming independents. Where do you stand on constitutional recognition and a voice to Parliament?
Thanks, Jacob. Look, firstly, let us acknowledge Sorry Day and the importance of that to this country. I can't speak for all the other independents because we're actually, believe it or not, independent. But, I've a stated view on this, which is that I'm fully supportive of the Uluru Statement of the Heart, and I would really like us to have a referendum on that as soon as possible. I know that the Greens don't feel that way. I think that it's been 6 years.
We'll come to you, Senator. We'll come to you, Senator. Sorry, just finish.
It's been 6 years since we've received the Uluru Statement for the Heart. It's time for First Nations people to have their voice. OK, Andrew
Bragg, you've written a book about this. You're a supporter of enshrining in the Constitution a voice to Parliament. Will you be able to bring your Liberal colleagues with you on this?
Well, I mean, everyone talks about supporting the statement. I mean, the statement calls for embedding a change to our Constitution, and the wording and the models that would need to be circulated is now the next step. And I think that is something that we should try and support. It's something that I personally support, and I think that it would be a very important change for our country. I'd like to see us achieve this by Australia Day 2024, which is the date that Indigenous leaders have asked for us to try and address it by. I think it's really important, and it is an opportunity for us to try and work as a parliament together. Of course, we disagree on some things, but on some things like this, I think they should be above politics.
Mehreen, Faruqi.
The Greens were actually the first party to sign on to the Uluru Statement from the Heart. We want it fully implemented. It has many elements to it. It also has truth and treaty and voice. I think it is really important for us to have a Truth and Justice Commission. So there is an acknowledgement in this country, which still isn't there, of the violence and the genocide of white Australia when, First Nations peoples were dispossessed. And that racism and discrimination still continues to this day.
But to be clear,
so we would
the Greens want that before a referendum?
We would like it to complement.
Before a referendum or after?
The voice. We will never stand in the way of progress towards First Nations justice. It is actually the Liberal Party for 9 years who has stood in that way. And I was really, I welcome and was really pleased with what Linda Burney, who is the next minister, has been saying today, that she really wants to bring all parties together, have consensus and progress truth treaty and voice simultaneously. And I think that will be incredible. It will bring the community together and it will bring parliamentarians together.
Amanda Rishworth?
Yeah, look, it is clearly a priority of Anthony Albanese and the Labor government. Of course, we've got to progress on detail. We've got to progress on consensus. And I can't think of a better person to lead that than Linda Burney. But as she's said, we do want to have voice. We do want to have truth-telling through a Makarrata Commission. So there are significant work to be done to bring the country together, to develop consensus. But I think this is entirely achievable, and we do want to see this in our first term. And I feel that we will all be prouder as a nation if we achieve this.
Alexander Downer, final word to you on this. What are your thoughts?
Well, I can't add much to what's been said, but my final word would be that to get a referendum passed is perilously difficult in Australia. It is extremely difficult. And so if people want, if politicians like the four here want a referendum to pass, they might forego a lot of traditional politicking and sneering at the other party. I wouldn't have made those points about the Liberals if you want the Liberals to support the referendum, because if you want the referendum to be passed, try to make constructive remarks about each other. As Anthony,
but you'd make those
Anthony
terrible
Albanese,
comments about the independents
Anthony
anyway,
Albanese
right?
says, you'd like to see a kinder politics. And this will be a huge test for that.
And just to be clear, would you be advocating to the current Liberal Party that they should back enshrining in the Constitution?
Well, I just have to have a look at what was... I mean, I don't know enough about it. Right. It would depend very much on what the government came up with, I suppose. And they will come up with it in negotiations with the Liberal Party and others.
Look, and we will continue this important discussion next week when the incoming Indigenous Affairs Minister, Linda Burney, who we've been talking about, joins us on the panel here on the Q&A with Stan Grant. Look, that is all we have time for tonight. Thanks to our panel, Monique Ryan, Andrew Bragg, Mehreen Faruqi, Amanda Rishworth and Alexander Downer. Thank you for your questions tonight and to you at home for joining the conversation and streaming us on iView.